The Book of Daniel has interesting drinking stories, and that's exactly what we're going to explore on this 171st episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, and I'm very excited to welcome back second-time guest of the show, Professor Caryn Tamber-Rosenau. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. All right. So for those less familiar with Professor Tamber-Rosenau, she is an assistant professor of Jewish studies and religious studies at the University of Houston. She is also the director of Jewish studies there. She is the author of the book Women in Drag, Gender and Performance in the Hebrew Bible and Early Jewish Literature, 2018 Georges Press, and is working on a book about time and history in the books of Esther, Daniel, Judith, and Tobit for Oxford University Press. But and speaking of one of those four books, she was previously on when we talked about wine in the Book of Judith. So people are very welcome to check that episode out. But one of those aforementioned books in that book's title is Daniel, which brings us to our topic today, which is wine and drinking in the Book of Daniel. For context, for our listeners, there might be listeners out there who are incredibly well acquainted with this book and super familiar with that, but I would put those perhaps in the minority of listeners or viewers. For those of us, or just in general, what can you tell us about the Book of Daniel, broadly speaking?
Absolutely. So I'm currently writing the book.
Okay.
It hasn't been published yet. I actually have been working on the Daniel chapter all summer.
Oh, wow.
And I'm now just today turning my attention to Tobit. So I've been really immersed in Daniel for a few months now. And
Perfect.
so the book is the book is fabulous. It is unbelievably weird. It's probably the latest book of the Jewish canon to actually have been written. So the latest thing that actually makes it into our Tanakh that was written. It's probably written in the 2nd century. We can date it fairly well, or at least parts of it fairly well. The book is really divided into two halves, and the first half, chapters 1 through 6, is the court tales. It tells the story of Daniel and his companions in the courts of various foreign empires. And then the second half of the book, chapters 7 through 12, is a series of apocalyptic dreams and visions that Daniel has as a prophet, where he is having visions of things that are going to happen. The book is also very strange because it is actually bilingual. So it begins in Hebrew, and then it switches in chapter 2 to Aramaic, and then it's in Aramaic all the way through into chapter 7, and then it switches back to Hebrew for the rest of the book.
Wow.
So yeah, not only is it bilingual, but the Hebrew and Aramaic does not even follow the genre differentiation, right? The court tales versus the apocalypses. So it's very unusual in many different ways. And that's just a taste.
There was also something, so I imagine it's not just a language or linguistic aspect. Before we started recording, you mentioned something about the familiarity of Jews generally with the Book of Daniel being not so much.
Yes,
so
not
can
so
you
much.
Can you talk to us about sort of the cultural context, Jews and Christians, or sort of differing familiarities with this book?
So yeah, I would say that most Jews that I speak to do not know the Book of Daniel terribly well, and that's for a couple of reasons. Where Christians put Daniel among the prophets, Jews do not. So Christians have 4 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And we do not put Daniel among the Nevi'im, among the prophets. Daniel's in the Ketuvim, in the writing section. So that means...
I didn't know that they consider them to be prophetic. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So what that means in practice is that we never read portions of Daniel in Haftorah, right? So while we read things like Isaiah, right, or Kings, First and Second Kings, as companions to the Torah report, as Haftarot, we do not do that with Daniel. So we don't read it in that context. And then 5 of the Ketuvim are Megillot. They're the scrolls, and they go along. Each goes along with a different Jewish holiday. Daniel is not. Daniel's not one of those. So Daniel basically does not get read in a liturgical context. And I was wondering if we have any liturgy that mentions Daniel at all. And so I asked one of my rabbis, and he mentioned that there is actually a reference in the High Holiday liturgy, very briefly, to Daniel. But that was all he could think of, and that's all I can think of. So we
Huh.
just, yeah, we don't read it aloud in synagogue. So Christians, on the other hand, there is so much engagement with Daniel. So both because Daniel
Hmm.
is one of the prophets, and because Daniel is interpreted in Christianity as predicting a lot of
Hmm.
Jesus's life and deeds, and because it's often paired with their book of Revelation, as you
Hmm.
know, because Revelation is highly, highly dependent on Daniel and very influenced by Daniel.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, Christianity engages with Daniel far more, and I mean, if you just go on Google and you're looking for Christian interpretations of Daniel, it's really fascinating, and they just
Hmm.
engage with it a lot more. So I would
Hmm.
say that Christians tend to be way more familiar with Daniel than Jews are.
That is very insightful. Wine appears a little bit, not a lot, but not in the book of Daniel. And it starts off in the very first chapter, right? So we see this, and this is, you mentioned it's still in Hebrew. It's here in the first chapter, and it takes on something that I don't think we've really seen elsewhere in Tanakh. I'm really trying to jog my mind, but this Daniel resolving in verse 8, Daniel resolving not to defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. That, I mean, that's there's something interesting there.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not thinking of a ton in Tanakh, but I am thinking of a couple of things in Septuagint and Apocrypha that are
Hmm.
nice parallels. One of those is something that we talked about, those many years ago when we recorded the Judith episode
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
And Judith is, going into this enemy Assyrian camp, and they're like, "Well, can we give you wine and food?" And she's like, "Nope, I brought my own."
Mm.
And then in the Septuagint Esther, so not the Esther that ends up, the Masoretic Esther, not
Hmm.
Hebrew Esther, but Greek Esther,
Mm.
Esther is really concerned with defilement as well.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, so we do see this in Daniel, and it's really interesting. It
Mm.
is the first instance of Daniel's kind of pushing back against
Mm.
imperial control. So
Mm.
Daniel and his companions have been taken as, from the elites of
Mm.
Judah into exile in Babylonia, which is, a historical detail in that there were Jewish elites, the elites of Judah taken into exile in Babylonia, right? But
Mm.
in here, what we don't have evidence of, and what Daniel, the conceit of Daniel, is that they're taken to serve as wise men, to train and then serve as wise men in the court
Mm.
of the Babylonian king.
Mm. Oh,
So
wow.
Daniel and his friends find themselves as young men being trained as wise men, seers, servants in the court of the
Mm.
Babylonian king. First thing that the king does is, here I'm providing you with your meals because you are, well, I'm making you be here, but you're also in a courtly way my guests, right? So it's the sign of the king's largesse and the king's provision for all of these foreign boys who've been brought to train as Babylonian wise men. But Daniel immediately says,
Well, so
no.
so I'm gonna pause here.
Yeah,
So
please.
he in verse 5 he gives them food and also wine, which is certainly nice. It's definitely a lovely gesture. And then we do see in 8 where he seems to be he refuses. It's not clear what the, I guess, the defilement aspect is. He wants to not defile himself. And I'm really trying to not fast forward ahead to the rabbis where it's sort of this Gentile wine notion being off limits or somehow a slippery slope to who knows what. But is that maybe going, like I'm like, I have those lenses on. I have the rabbinic lenses, and I'm like, I can't take the rabbinic wine lenses off. Like,
Yeah.
can you help me with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely on target in that the text does not tell us what the problem is.
Mm.
And so, of course, if we are, we're all rabbinic Jews now, the only thing we can do is fast forward
Hmm.
to the rabbis to try to make sense of, the more restrictive kashrut and the more restrictive
Hmm.
rules about, Gentile wine and whatever.
Hmm.
I'm not sure that what we're dealing with here is specific to the wine. I think that we need to
Mm,
read the wine and the food together and
mm,
just see that there is a problem with Gentile provisions as a
mm.
whole. Like there's some sort of, I think the only way that we can understand it is there's some kind of a kashrut problem, which is also
Uh,
the only way we can understand Judith. There's some sort of kashrut problem. What that is, we don't know because neither
huh.
Daniel nor Judith will tell us. We don't have specifics, but there's some sort of a problem with defilement with consuming Gentile wine and food.
Huh.
We don't know what.
It's, I mean, the temporal aspect is so fascinating because if you, like, I just mentioned the fast forward to the rabbis, and we have those lenses going back. There's nothing really, I mean, there are food restrictions in the Torah. I also think about there, but there's nothing really wine related except for maybe nothing to do with Gentile libations. But I think that that really provides us, for me, a curiosity about the things that are roughly contemporaneous. You mentioned Judith, but it's you're saying it's also not really clear, even though she brought her own food and wine, what that issue is about.
No, they say like, well, where can you get it would be wrong for me to partake in what you're offering here in the Assyrian military camp in Judith. But they don't explain why. They don't get into the, any aspects of halakha, right? So all we can kind of do is say, all right, we would like to know more, but the text is not really telling. So
Mhm.
we have to fill in the blanks as best we can, or just accept the fact that something was wrong with the food. They're not going to tell us why.
Also, something you said was really fascinating for me to hear, which was this seems to be his first act of pushing back. And it's so amusing that the first act of a Jew pushing back has to do with the food and the drink. It's
Yes,
consumption.
yes. Yeah, I mean it's really symbolic, right? It's not
Uh,
just, oh, it's a nice gesture.
uh-huh.
It's the food and drink, it's so symbolic, right?
Mm,
You you are what the king is saying, what we can interpret the king is saying is you are now a member of the Babylonian elite
mm,
and you are going to eat and drink as we eat and drink. And so
mm,
Daniel's for the first thing he does is, no, I'm not, right? Because there's
mm,
always a broader meaning to food and drink as
mm,
identity markers. And I think, it's certainly symbolic, and we can see it as symbolic here of
mm,
of something more than just what I'm eating, but like what he's putting in his body, he does not want to ingest, right? The Babylonianness, the Babylonian
mm.
identity. No, I'm not gonna do it. So he pushes back.
For me, it's I have two things in my mind. The first of which is the sort of the general amusement with Jews and food. Like it's just funny. Like of course it's food and Jews. But less jokingly is, and more fascinating for our conversation is, well, wine plays a role here too. Maybe definitely a different role than it did in Tobit, but a not unimportant role. It's sort of the beginning of his pushing back here. And wine, there's a significance here. It's I know you said symbolic, but there seems to be a significance to the wine. It was like the king's drunk wine or something. Uyain mishtav. In verse 8, when it says the uyain mishtav, I mean, it's not really
Yeah.
clear. It's I mean, this English translation said the wine he drank, that maybe the king drank it. It could also be the wine from their drinking parties. It could be like a mishteh, and then this is just like the his drinking party. I have
Yeah.
not explored different translations, so I don't know, but I'm curious if it was like, well, we served this at our royal party. It was awesome. Uh,
I mean, yeah, it could be. We could, I suppose, read it as a noun, but I'm gonna parse it as a verb, an infinitive absolute, so that it's like his drinking, like the the
mhm,
the wine that he drank, right? Like
mhm.
the king's wine.
Not that it was like seconds, or that there was backwash,
No,
but just it
no, I
was
don't
it
think
was
so.
the highest wine available. If the king's drinking
Yeah.
it and it's made available to them, this is the finest quality wine around.
Yeah, it's the best. The king is saying, like, what's mine is yours. You're going to
Mm,
live in my palace. And if you're living in my palace, I'm going to feed you and I'm going to give you
wine,
wine
the
because
best
that's what
wine,
people drink, right?
the best
Nobody's,
wine.
yeah. And you'll be happy with it. And Daniel's like,
Mm,
nope, not so fast. I will not defile myself.
mm,
But he has to ask permission. He has to ask the person who is in
mm,
charge of him, the eunuch, or the official, right? It does
Hmm.
actually say eunuch, saris, right?
Yeah, does
He
say
has to ask
eunuchs.
the head of the eunuchs, the sarisim.
I was going to say English translations sometimes just try to gloss over things. So, but you're right. These
Yeah,
are eunuchs. Yeah.
yeah. The New Revised Standard Version that I'm looking at right now is saying the palace master, but really what it says is the chief eunuch.
Yeah.
So he has to ask permission of a supervisor to not have the consume the food and wine.
Hmm.
And the eunuch is like, no, this is bad. It's going to actually reflect really badly on me, the eunuch. If
Mm,
you're not having the provisions that the king is giving you, that's going to make me look bad.
mm,
And so Daniel says, well, here's the test. Give us only seeds,
mhm,
only, vegetable seeds, pulses. It can be, translated a bunch of ways. We're not going to be eating the meat. We're not going to be drinking the wine. Give us water and seeds, and
mhm,
we'll see what happens in 10 days. Like if we look really haggard and thin,
mm,
then we'll talk. But if we look really good, then you'll know that there's something else going on here and that we were right.
mm. And also, we do see drinking here, but it's water instead of wine,
Yes.
which is definitely an interesting choice. Which I can't help but like my mind thinks about kashrut, but maybe it could also be related to, I don't know, maybe they were libated somehow. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or maybe like you were maybe something else. Maybe it has nothing to do with the actual physical aspect. It may be just more of a general pushback. They don't want to be part of this system.
Yeah. I mean, and if we look at it in the context of the rest of Daniel and his three friends' pushback against the system,
Hmm.
they are basically constantly fighting back against some aspect of being in the Babylonian court.
Hmm.
So that's how I like to read it. That this is really the first act of disobedience, and it works out well for them. It works out okay.
Hmm.
They do their special diet for 10 days and they look great. They look better than the guys who have been consuming all the largesse of the king's table, including the wine.
Hmm.
And so, and the king even tests them and he, gives them pop quiz. And hey, these four guys are pretty smart. And he stations them in the court. So
Hmm.
rejecting the food and wine is a point of tension at first, but because at the end they're found to look really hale and hearty, they
Hmm.
win. They win the battle.
Hey there, I wanted to break in. I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. I wanted to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode. Since Purim is around the corner, we're going to be discussing women and Purim drinking. Here we go.
No, he doesn't want women to get drunk.
Oh,
Because as
okay.
you've discussed in previous, meaning it says the Gemara in Ketubot basically tells us women shouldn't be getting drunk.
Uh-huh.
So, and as you've discussed previously, there's some question whether men are always allowed to get drunk or people are always allowed to get drunk, or there's like an exception for a particular extent of drunkenness on Purim. And otherwise, the rabbis were more into now, moderation doesn't mean you can't get drunk, but maybe not blackout drunk.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this episode on drinking in the book of Daniel. We see in chapter 5, wine appears again. The return of wine. And so here King Belshazzar gave a great banquet, and now we are clearly in Aramaic. So he makes them a banquet, and in the presence of the 1,000 nobles, he drank wine, nothing particularly special, but under the influence of wine in verse 2, he ordered the gold and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple Jerusalem to be brought so that the king and his nobles, his consorts and his concubines could drink from them. So the golden vessels that had been taken out of the sanctuary of the house of God in Jerusalem in verse 3 were then brought, and the king, his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines drank from them. This is clearly drinking, although it's not Jewish drinking. It's definitely drinking. They Thank you. Verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And they're having a grand old time. It is fantastic. Actually, I'm just going to pause us there. And so this is clearly I don't know, profoundly perverse use of these vessels. And not all of them necessarily. It also, by the way, it seems to me that not all these vessels are necessarily constructed for the purposes of drinking, right? Or even libations that they just happen to maybe you definitely have done a lot more research. I don't know a lot about Daniel, but they to me they probably have, some container aspect that can contain liquids from which people can drink. But it seems that this is it's a huge pervert, not only because these are used, and there seems to be maybe this is the way I'm reading it, a little bit of a sense of idolatrousness, or certainly inappropriate use of them for drinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the text. The
Mhm.
narrator is certainly horrified. I think we can tell that the narrator is quite horrified at this.
By the way, it
And
doesn't state that, but it's just so clearly there.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it is so clear, I think,
yeah.
here are the clues, right? Because it describes Belshazzar as drunk. He's under the influence when he makes this decision.
Mm,
So he's not at his best, his best, highest mental capacity.
mhm.
And then he brings
Hmm.
in the vessels, and then they
Huh.
praise
Their gods.
their gods, right? So I think that we're supposed to take this as, the narrator is not pleased.
Right. It's also funny because this doesn't seem to have been necessarily a decision he would have made not under the influence of alcohol, but it's once he started getting drunk and drinking, he's like, I've got a great idea.
Like, what would be really cool, guys?
Right. It's definitely a very interesting biblical drinking story. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
It's fascinating, and
Mhm.
I mean, I think that more so than what would be a great idea, right? I think we can read this as kind of a middle finger to
Mhm.
Belshazzar, just flipping the bird
Mhm.
to the conquered people, right?
Yeah.
And this is
Yeah.
not something that is totally, we don't know about necessarily this kind of incident, but there are
Mhm.
certainly incidents from elsewhere in ancient Jewish literature in the Bible, right, where there's an episode there's an element of humiliation
Mm.
to the conquered peoples. I'm thinking of, this is a couple of centuries later, but we get the Romans minting coins that say Judea capta
Mhm.
at the end of the Great Revolt, or the
Mhm.
Arch of Titus, with them carrying again the temple vessels, carrying off the temple
Mhm.
vessels. Look what we
Yeah.
got! They're really nice, and now we're
Yeah.
memorializing them in our city.
I just
So
want
yeah,
to
I
point
mean,
out that was
yeah.
definitely the first numismatic reference on the show.
Oh, I'm so honored. That's great. We gotta talk about coins. It's fun. But yeah, no, there's definitely this element of like,
Uh,
let's stick it to them a little bit. We're gonna drink out of their sacred vessels.
mhm.
And he's drunk, so he's not at his best, we would
Mhm.
think. So yeah, narrator not pleased.
Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode.
Is there something also to be said about the people involved? Like, I think it's one thing to have your nobles there, but that also the consorts and the concubines. Like, I feel that this is like, I'm just letting anybody drink now.
I mean, I guess
Okay.
I do think it's interesting that this is like one of the very few references in the entire book to women.
Oh, okay.
So I do think that that is interesting. I'm not quite sure what to make of it here, but that
Mhm.
he's got his queen and his
All his sexual
secondary
partners.
women, right?
It seems to be
But
all his sexual partners.
yeah,
Yeah.
his all of the wives, all of the queen, the queen, the wives, and the concubines are all there, which is super super interesting.
Hmm.
I do wonder, maybe
Hmm.
in the ancient world, you know, there are some contexts in which mixed drinking might be inappropriate, and I do wonder if this
Hmm.
is just another way
Huh.
that the text is kind of painting like orientalizing the ruler here, the Babylonian ruler, and painting them as like, they're indulgent and they drink too much and they've got their women with them and the concubines are drinking out of, like, he's even letting his wives of
Right.
secondary status, all of
Right.
his, like, as you say, all his sexual partners drink
Yeah.
out of our sacred vessels, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, if you have any insights that make it into your book, feel free to feel free to reference this conversation. All right. I don't really know what else to say about. I mean, it does. I'm not like, I didn't even realize there's not so many references to ladies in this book in the first place, and
It's very dude heavy.
then it comes out
yeah.
through drinking, like, oh, let's let the ladies, but also it seems like there's just this mass flowing of wine available.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, and I think that this is something we also see in Esther, where the foreign kings are portrayed through their use of alcohol, through their use of wine, as like overindulgent. There is this characterization of foreign kings as soft or exotic or overindulgent. And this is a common characterization of Eastern kings, by which I mean Babylonian and Persian, really. It's common to not only biblical literature and other ancient Jewish literature, but also Greek sources of the same period. The Greeks are doing the same thing. They are orientalizing the Eastern kings and portraying them as too soft, and they're drunks, they hang out with women too much, they take counsel from women too much, right? So this is not coming out of nowhere. This is absolutely happening in other ancient Jewish texts, and it's also happening with the Greeks. The Greeks are doing the same thing with those Eastern kings, right?
Yeah. Huh. Wow. So they drank wine, they praised the gods of all these different I don't want to call them metals, yes,
Materials,
but other
yeah.
materials, yeah, more broadly. And I think that's really where that is really the climax of the perverseness and certainly the inappropriateness. All the while, I really just don't see the language explicitly, overtly, that this is a bad thing, but just between every single line, it's, I would say, horrified. Like, they're just absolutely like horrified at this, and this is the most perverse use of these. And then they praise the gods. Like, this seems to be the this is just the whipped cream on top. That's not the right language. The cherry on top. And this does it all. Like, this is just, it was bad enough up until then, and then it got like, it just couldn't get worse.
Yeah, and then you read the rest of the chapter.
Yeah.
And then when you read the rest of the chapter, like, all those, like, reading between the lines, this is really bad, just become, it's made much clearer. So, what we have is in verse 4, in chapter 5, verse 4, they drank the wine, and they're drinking the wine out of the vessels, and they're praising all their gods. And then verse 5, the very next verse, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall. And so this is where we get, he saw the handwriting on the wall, right?
That's where it comes from.
So yeah, so many fun idioms come from the Book of Daniel, like feet of clay. That's also from Daniel, which is really nice. All these things that make it into our
English expressions,
our vernacular. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the king here sees a disembodied hand, apparently, because it says, it doesn't say that there is a person, it doesn't say there's a person writing this. It's just the fingers of a human hand. When I talk to my students, I ask them if they've seen the Addams Family, because
but now it's Wednesday. I
always think of thing, right?
Yeah.
You're right. The Addams Wednesday. You're right. I gotta get with the program.
I mean, we can think about Addams Family movies. Those are great.
No, they're
but now we have Wednesday.
Yeah, this is true. So I think of thing.
Absolutely.
Right. And it's often represented that way in, like, Renaissance art when painters are doing it. But so there's the fingers of a hand write something on the wall, and the king is freaked out because he's just seen a hand writing on the wall, and he basically, like, physically, it's described as he's physically
he's
panicking.
affected.
Yeah,
it's not just his face, his joints
together. Yeah, his loins were loosened. That sounds really alarming. So he is losing all control here, and he is freaked out, and he calls for his magicians and his magic men to be like, hey, can you guys tell me what's going on here?
Yeah.
And they can't. And so they have to call for reinforcements, and the reinforcements are Daniel, which is really interesting. So here again, we have a woman. We have the queen. When she heard the discussion, came into the hall and said, hey, don't freak out here. Your father, Nebuchadnezzar, knew this guy, Daniel. And why Belshazzar has no idea who Daniel is, even though Daniel has been in his father's court the whole time and continues to serve in his court, we don't know. That's a mystery. But it's just not one of the temporal oddities of the book.
But if I may, it could be like maybe he never developed a relationship or really understood what he did or what his role was, and he could also have been out of touch. Who knows? Like Belshazzar, like
maybe
who's to say? He's like, what do I need to know them for? Like they're my father's court.
Yeah, but I mean, in
Maybe
verse
he's
11
arrogant.
it says Nebuchadnezzar made him chief of the magic men, right? He should know this guy, but he doesn't.
Okay.
So he doesn't know him. But the queen says, call Daniel. And so he calls Daniel, and Daniel's the only one who's able to read the writing on the wall. And he reads it, and it's Aramaic, and he interprets it. And when he interprets it, the interpretation is basically, well, you're in trouble. You are not going to be able to keep your kingdom very much longer. He says, your God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And Belshazzar is like, okay, he's got it. And then that very night, Belshazzar is killed, and the kingdom falls to Darius the Mede. So it's not only a change of king, it's a change of empire. The kingdom passes from the Babylonians to the Medes, which historically does not make sense. It does, there's a lot of historical weirdness here, but there is nobody in history called Darius the Mede. There were Dariuses who were Persians, but the temporal thing, the timing does not work out. But that's maybe a story for my book. It doesn't have a lot to do with wine. But yeah. So
by the way,
so
drinking
when we read
does
to the end,
we do get a reference here. I mean, it's just a reference to what happened. It was in this verse
to
23.
recounting the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, but when we read down to the end of the chapter, what we find is that clearly, like, God is not pleased. God is not pleased. The narrator is not pleased. Belshazzar gets drunk, drinks out of the temple vessels. The writing appears on the wall, and that leads to, the interpretation of the writing. The interpretation of the writing is true. He is killed. So that very night, the same night that he drinks out of the temple vessels, he is killed. By whom? By what? The text does not say, but I think we're meant to, interpret this as a divine comeuppance.
Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show.
So these two, chapter 1, chapter 5, are really it when it comes to wine and drinking in this book, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, how would you describe, now that we've seen them up close, these chapters 1 and 5, and the roles that wine and drinking play? I mean, certainly we saw that wine kicked off Daniel's pushing back, and then the drunken temple vessel party was really the final night of that king's life and reign. So not insignificant, certainly. How would you characterize these stories, these incidences more broadly affecting the book of Daniel and its story?
So I think I would characterize them differently. I think what's happening at the beginning of the book in chapter 1 is wine as a symbol of the kingdom. Wine is a symbol of the hospitality of the king. And when Daniel rejects the wine, he rejects the hospitality of the king, and he rejects becoming fully Babylonian. And what I think is happening later in the book, in chapter 5, is the wine, and more than that, the drunkenness as a symbol of the degenerate nature of these Eastern kings, which again is pretty common to other texts that we do see in Esther as well, where of course Ahasuerus is hosting constant drinking parties. This guy he always has a tumbler of something in his hand, and he is constantly drinking. So I think we see this common and more widespread characterization of Eastern kings as degenerate, as drunken. And here, the drunkenness and the idolatry and the disrespect for, the people of the covenant, for God's people, is all tied together.
Professor Tamber-Rosenau, this has been certainly interesting, fascinating, insightful. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
Sure. So as we talked about before, I am working on a book about time and history in 4 Second Temple texts, in Esther, Daniel, Judith, and Tobit, and tentatively titled at this point, Queering History in Second Temple Jewish Literature. I am under contract with Oxford University Press, and I am hoping that the book will be out in 2025 or more likely 2026.
I mean, time is part of the book, so it's important to know when the timing of the book's publishing. Okay, that's good. So either later this year or next year, 2026.
Yeah, temporal weirdness is what the book is about, so I can be forgiven if I'm missing that deadline.
Okay, there you go. It's on brand. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. With that, thank you so much, and l'chaim.
L'chaim.